Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the second PowerPoint for week 9 of When Worlds Collide in 2020. Sorry, I'm re-recording this because the original version didn't work properly. I'm sorry for that. Hopefully you've listened to the first PowerPoint before this one. If you haven't already, you should. I've described there those pictures on the right hand side of the screen. That is of course the man we call the Mahatma Gandhi. The Mohandas Gandhi was his actual name. And there is he on the cover of Time magazine, which at that point was the biggest marker you had in the world of being a celebrity. Mohandas Gandhi, and there is his life date, was born, as you can see, into a wealthy family in Gujarat. He was born to a wealthy family, but not in the intellectual hub of British colonial India, which was West Bengal, and his family weren't Brahmins. So he came from a wealthy family, but not the same kind of family as some of the people we've looked at before, such as Rammohun Roy. But like Rammohun Roy and others before him, he had a strong connection with Britain. He took his law degree at the University of London, and he faced the same resistance from his relatives to going to England that Rammohun Roy had all those years before. There in the bottom right-hand on the right-hand side of the screen, there you can see Gandhi as a young man in Britain, all dressed up as an English gentleman, complete with the wing collar on his shirt of the time. In bottom right-hand corner, you can see him there later in life, back in Britain again, with the then leader of the British Labour opposition, after Lansbury, and with a bunch of poor British kids from the north of England, and there Gandhi as being the saint figure that he became famous for being. So in London as a young man, yes, he dressed like a gentleman. He moved amongst religious radicals in a similar way to the way Rammohun Roy had all those years before. He met British anti-colonialist activists such as the socialist Annie Besant, since anti-colonialism was now a thing in Britain in Gandhi's lifetime. More about that in a minute. He discovered vegetarianism, which became important to his personal spirituality, and he also discovered the pacifist and non-violent writings of European literary and philosophical figures like the famous Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy. He met and argued, as I said there, with Christians of a range of different kinds, both orthodox and unorthodox. In all those respects, his young adulthood shadows some of the experiences of Rammohun Roy later in his life. He also read the ancient Hindu texts, but not in the original Sanskrit, in modern English translation. That's the way he came to the ancient scriptures of his own religion. Last dot point there, Gandhi later reported that as a young man in Britain, he passed as an English gentleman, just with a different colour skin. He was not the first young Indian man to be in Britain, studying, well-to-do, and so racism of the kind he later experienced in his life wasn't obvious to him in the first couple of decades of his life. However, having graduated with a university degree, Gandhi then travelled to South Africa to begin his law career. And in South Africa, suddenly he discovered a new world. South Africa was also a British colony, as India had become part of the British Empire. It had a black minority population, of course, a minority population called coloureds, as was the technical term of the capital C under the later apartheid system. And there were whites, British whites and Dutch whites, the so-called Afrikaners. And Gandhi fell into the second of these two categories. He was coloured, and so he was not part of an apartheid system, since that didn't exist, but he was treated as an inferior race by many white South Africans, British and otherwise, but particularly the Dutch. And he, like other Indians in South Africa, was subjected to restrictions on the basis of the colour of his skin and his ancestry. He had to sit in some train carriages and not others. He wasn't allowed to sit in a first-class carriage. He had to observe a curfew at night time. He had to make way for white people on the footpath, somewhat like African American people in the southern states, the United States, in the middle of the 20th century. This was Gandhi's first real experience of racism in the raw, and it transformed him and his life. He set up a civil rights movement South Africa, but for Indian South Africans rather than black South Africans. So there was a limit to his vision in that respect. And at this time, he starts drawing upon Indian and Hindu philosophical concepts, particularly the term satyagraha, which he modelled on and shaped according to Leo Tolstoy's concept of passive resistance, that you resisted the authorities in the exercise of unjust laws, not by violence, but by simply refusing to obey, if necessary, by being arrested. In Gandhi's mind, Satyagraha was not, in fact, simply a political doctrine. It was, in fact, if you like, a lifestyle doctrine. It was a way of living your life. It was a spirituality, if you like. And he believed that non-violent resistance to oppression was a form of self-purification, and it's important to understand that, I think, to understand Gandhi's life and some of the things he did which seemed strange to other people. Gandhi's often been thought of as a kind of religious guru or even a saint kind of figure. The title Mahatma suggests he was a kind of saint in the Hindu pantheon. But in fact, his religious outlook was really Gandhi's own one. It was not traditional Hinduism. It was not even really the Hinduism of Ramamohan Roy. It was his self-constructed version of Hinduism, onto which he'd grafted a variety of other religious and philosophical ideas. Like Ramamohan Roy, he was influenced by Christianity, and especially the example of Jesus, and he borrows from the so-called Sermon on the Mount that you find in the Christian Gospel according to Matthew, supposedly Jesus' moral creed as presented by Matthew. And he adopted various European and Hindu ideas alike on denial, on sexual and other forms of self-denial, and on the shaping of one's diet by vegetarianism and other ideas. He rejected Christianity, not in the sense of opposing it, but he did not become a Christian. Like Ramamohan Roy, he found the concept of the Trinity peculiar and couldn't make sense of it, and he preferred to think of Jesus as a kind of wise man, such as one found in other religions, Confucius, the Buddha, whoever it might be. He had the idea, which of course he shared with some of the religious radicals in Britain, that the essence of all religions was the same thing, and that the essence of religion in the end was morality and personal self-purification, an idea that you could find in traditional Hindu culture, but also in aspects of Christianity and indeed in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy in the Western tradition as well. As I mentioned already, Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, became his hero for his writings both on non-violent resistance and Tolstoy's own peculiar conception of Christianity, which Tolstoy preserved in a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You, which doesn't sell nearly as well as War and Peace or Anna Karenina or Tolstoy's other famous novels, but nevertheless was extremely influential in and after Tolstoy's lifetime. It presented Christianity as basically an interior doctrine of self-inspection and self-purification. The kingdom of God is inside your own person rather than outside. This helped shape Gandhi's personal creed, the idea that religion is ultimately a form of self-shaping and self-purification. Often it is said nowadays in the modern West that the personal is political. It was a slogan of feminists in the 1970s and 1980s in the West. It's more or less commonly adopted in practice. Obviously, for vegetarians and vegans, it is sometimes a rule of life, which it was for Gandhi as a vegetarian as well. But in Gandhi's case, this is true of his entire life. He shapes his politics through ideas that are about, as I said, personal, spiritual self-development. Transforming yourself is the cause of political change, he claims. Politics is only the effect. You first have to change yourself before you can change the world. This makes him a very difficult political opponent for his opponents to make sense of. He breaks all the normal rules of politics. He doesn't oppose by presenting alternate points of view laid out as political principles. Rather, he opposes in philosophical ways. When the British do something oppressive, he doesn't issue a statement. Instead, he embarks upon a period of fasting and abstinence. which the British initially find amusing, but then when they notice that Gandhi's gestures are often very effective with poorer Indians especially, the British become frustrated and annoyed by him. At the same time, he could also be a difficult ally, and his allies in the Indian nationalist movement found him so from time to time. The two key terms, and I've mentioned one of them already, that define Gandhi's philosophical, spiritual outlook on the world are brahmacharya, this idea of self-purification as a means of ascending to the truth, where truth is a political truth but also a spiritual truth around the world, purification of oneself by dieting, fasting, abstinence of various kinds, including sexual abstinence. These were all fundamental acts, renunciation of the ills and evils of the world and disciplining yourself against them. Obviously, they were a kind of minority creed. You can't actually preach sexual abstinence to the entire population, or clearly the world would cease to exist, or at least humans would. It's something that people imagining themselves to have a special spiritual vocation do. And that's what Gandhi primarily, I think, thought of himself as doing. The term, as I mentioned already, satyagraha, which is often translated as passive resistance, was picked up by Gandhi from ideas that already existed in the Indian nationalist movement, but he again gave it a spiritual turn. Rather than just being passive resistance as a political principle, he meant it was a way of living your entire life. You didn't resist evil by physical force, rather you simply refused to engage with it, and did that in a way that made your opponent, made it necessary for your opponent to deal with your refusal to engage. You did it spectacularly in ways that required you particularly to be arrested. If you turned to violence to counter violence, according to Gandhi's philosophy, this was a failure of your self-purification. You always presented yourself as being, and believed yourself to be, purer than the people whom you were opposing. This also made it difficult for the British to understand how to deal with him. He positively invited being arrested and put in jail, and seemed perfectly happy there, to the point where the British were trying to find ways not to arrest him, and Gandhi was trying to find ways to be arrested. So the whole game of politics, as the British understood it, was turned on its head. The most famous symbol of Gandhi's philosophical outlook on the world was the spinning wheel. It was both a political symbol and, if you like, a personal spiritual one. Swadeshi, or self-reliance, was a nationalist slogan that predated Gandhi. It meant essentially that India should strive to be self-reliant in the world of nations and as an economy, and not dependent upon and shaped by the British colonial economy and the British state. But he gives it new meaning. Now it's not simply narrowly a political and economic slogan, but it's a philosophy of life as well. India is in fact a country built around manual labour and craft, and the vocation for shaping things with your hands, which is what the spinning wheel, manual spinning wheel, represented for Gandhi. Creating your own clothes and spinning the cloth out of which they were made on your own spinning wheel at home, for Gandhi, was the ultimate symbol of the Indian way of life and its superiority and purity compared with modern Western materialist, individualist ways of life that he suggested that Indians had to reject. So Britain, the colonial power in India, was, on Gandhi's account, as a modern industrialised country, weaker and poorer than India, not in money terms, but spiritually, if you like. The British had lost some element of their own persons in the modern factory system and industrialisation, which they could not recover. And Indians had an obligation to avoid that fate and also to teach the British about the ills of their ways of life. This was annoying to some Britons, but to many Britons also kind of worked. After all, in the modern West, we look to poor countries in the world often, imagining them to be places where the simple primal truths of life are to be found that we may have lost in our busy modern Western cluttered materialistic lives, etc. Gandhi represented that point of view and took it, as it were, to the West, and some Westerners were quite keen to hear it. He even went so far, extraordinarily actually, to travel to the mill towns of Lancashire in the north of England. When he visited England later in his life, you can see the picture bottom right hand corner of the screen there, to speak to the mill workers and their families, to explain his point of view and the standpoint of the Indians. And to the amazement of the British press, the mill workers and their families were often highly sympathetic. So Gandhi's appeal was not simply to Indians, but to British and to other people in the world as well. Gandhi helped sway public opinion, for instance, in the United States against British colonial rule in India in the first half of the 20th century. And that was a very important thing to have done, since it helped ensure that Britain became more isolated in the world, morally speaking, if you like, as a colonial power than it had been before. Up until that point, Americans and others outside the British Empire often hadn't taken much notice about what was happening in India. Gandhi, by the sort of drama of his life and the way he responded to British rule, focused attention on it and became a sympathetic figure. The British found themselves, as it were, with the moral low ground, and Gandhi had seized the moral high ground. So, to return back to the spinning wheel thing, the thing to do, according to Gandhi, as a form of personal but national self-purification, was to throw out the manufactured products of the British, actually put them in burning mounds, like funeral pyres, I was about to say, and throw those out, the manufactured rubbish, and spin your own clothes instead. It was kind of hippiedom before hippies came along. So this was non-violent resistance, but the British experienced it as being violent and arrested people when they gathered in the streets to burn clothes following Gandhi's lead. Which I think also raises an interesting question, not in the PowerPoint there, about violence and non-violence. Non-violence in Gandhi's hands was kind of like violence without violence, in the sense that you made a point spectacularly by burning things, destroying things, but no one got hurt. Okay, some final thoughts on Gandhi with a view to the clock here. It's common nowadays to downplay Gandhi's practical role and his practical influence on modern India. If we look at modern India in the year 2020, it is clearly not a Gandhian country. It went through a period of sort of industrialisation. It's now, as we are all aware, an economy shaped in good measure around the IT industries and communications. It doesn't present to us today as an especially spiritualist country. And the other thing, of course, that people are aware about in the world today is that India has now joined the ethno-nationalist trend of the contemporary world all across the world. And the Indian national leadership these days is increasingly a Hindu leadership, presenting India as a Hindu country. Whereas Gandhi was remorselessly, if I can use that word of Gandhi, opposed to narrow religious views, and he and the other Indian nationalist leaders, at least the ones who were not in the Muslim League, insisted that the India founded in 1947 had to become a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, a secular country whose secularism was founded upon the freedom to exercise your religion. It's not obvious that's the case in India right now. So for all those reasons, it's taken that Gandhi is an historical figure. I'll jump to the third dot point there. But Gandhi was clearly a decisive Indian figure in his lifetime. He created an image of India and Indianness that helped undermine British rule in ways that other forms of Indian nationalism had not been able to do. Whether or not it was realistic in political or economic terms as a way of shaping India as a nation is another question. But the pragmatic, economically trained nationalists like Jawaharlal Nehru primarily presented themselves as Europeanized Indians. Gandhi was able to present himself as an Indian in a whole new way, and in there lay his effectiveness. Also, as I mentioned already, Gandhi became a global celebrity, not just an Indian one, and therefore he transcended the particular Indian issues that were at stake in India and made a global spectacle of British colonialism. Most famous example of Gandhi's genius for the spectacular are those two images on the right-hand side of this last PowerPoint screen. You can see there, firstly, Gandhi leading a salt march to the sea in the last decades of British colonialism, and then you can see him with his followers in the sea. You might wonder what's going on there. The British had imposed a tax on salt. This for Gandhi was a perfect example of the ills of British rule and their silliness all at once. You can make your own salt. How could the British tax it if you did that? So he led his followers to the sea, where they panned salt from the sea to use themselves. Perfect Gandhian symbol. No practical utility, but an enormous symbolic power. It did not create a new salt industry, but it effectively undermined the arguments of the British that salt was something that you could tax like anything else. So Gandhi always sought to create, shape, and then hold the moral high ground in ways that made the death of British colonial India far more likely than it would otherwise have been, and probably brought it to a close quicker than it would have done. Sorry again for the first version of this not working. Hopefully this one will. Take care.